He died 10,000 years ago. The Emperor put him down personally, and the Imperium spent the next 100 centuries convincing itself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. The Chaos Gods do not agree on anything. They have never agreed on anything. Until the one thing they all wanted badly enough to work together to get it back. What came out of the Eye of Terror was still him. That is what no one was ready for. Still him, and knowing something he did not know before. What does a returned War Master want with a galaxy that moved on without him? It does not have nights, or seasons, or the comfortable rhythm of a sun moving across a sky that reminds you what time is and what it costs. Inside the eye, time moves the way fire moves through a building you are still standing in, inconsistent and hungry, and not particularly interested in your preferences about direction. I have lived inside that fire for 10,000 years, and I can tell you that what survives is not what you think will survive. The strength of your arms survives. The knowledge in your skull survives. Your hatred survives, in smaller quantities than you might expect. What does not survive is the certainty that you understand what you are doing or why. My name is Arevhas. I was born on Chthoniya, in the years when that world still existed as something more than a memory and a gravitational absence in the Sol system. I was a ganger before I was a legionnaire, which means I learned to fight in places where the rules were made by whoever was willing to enforce them with violence. And I understood very early that the universe does not operate on fairness or mercy, or the kind of abstract justice that philosophical men write books about in warm rooms while other men die in the dark outside. The universe operates on force and will, and the patience to outlast everything that does not share your determination to continue existing. The Lunar Wolves found me when I was 14 years old, which was old enough that I already knew this, and they taught me to apply it at a scale I had not previously imagined was possible. I wore grey armor for decades. I fought on 100 worlds whose names would mean nothing to you, clearing the way for an imperium that was still being built by a being I believed in absolutely. I believed in the Emperor of Mankind, the way you believe in something so large and constant that you cannot conceive of it being absent. He was the foundation beneath the foundation. He was the reason the stars were worth fighting for. I was loyal to him in the way that mountains are loyal to the planet they grow out of, which is to say without decision, without consideration, without the kind of deliberate choice that loyalty becomes when it has been tested and questioned and chosen again. And then Horus changed everything, and I was tested, and I chose. I am not going to explain that choice to you. It has been 10,000 years. Every argument I made then has been made again by men younger than me, and then refuted by men younger still, and the debate about what the War Master saw in the warp above Davin, about what the Emperor concealed from his sons, about whether the Horus heresy was a tragedy, or an inevitability, or a manufactured catastrophe, has occupied the minds of scholars and soldiers on both sides of the divide for all the millennia between then and now. I made a choice. I made it with everything I knew at the time. I have lived with it for 10,000 years, and that living has cost me more than any accounting I have ever been able to produce. What I can tell you is this. When the word came, 8 years ago by my uncertain reckoning, that something was changing in the eye, that something long believed destroyed was being recovered, I did not feel hope. I am beyond the age where hope arrives unannounced as a reflex. What I felt was something colder and more specific, something that did not have a name in any language I had learned to speak, but that lived in my chest behind my secondary heart and reminded me, in that particular way of old certainties half buried, that I had not been finished yet. The story was not done. I traveled to Asphodel to find out what that meant. The journey took 3 years in the way that journeys in the eye take time, which is to say inconsistently, with days that contained the hours of a week and weeks that passed in the subjective duration of an afternoon, and the distance covered bearing no reliable relationship to the distance estimated at departure. The eye does not cooperate with navigation. It tolerates it at best, the way a large predator tolerates the presence of something small that has learned to move carefully enough in its vicinity that attacking it represents more effort than ignoring it. API error. Response stalled midstream. The response above may be incomplete. Open my Google Doc titled O&O Stories Prompts OLD. From .extract the raw text under these sections only. Premise prompt, script prompt, scene prompt, hook prompt. Do not modify, summarize, or rewrite any of the prompt text. Use this title throughout the workflow. What happens when Horus finally returns in WH40K? Execute in strict order. Do not move to the next step until the previous step is fully complete. Step 1. Premise. Run the premise prompt using the title provided above. Use the full generated result as premise. Step 2. Script. Run the script prompt using the title, the full premise output from Step 1. Use the full generated result as script. Step 3. Scenes. Run the scene prompt using the full script output from Step 2. Step 4. Hook. Run the hook prompt using the full script output from Step 2. Rules. Do not create or save any files. Do not create Google Docs, TXT files, or Drive files. Only return results in chat. Do not truncate output. If the scene's output is cut off, continue automatically until complete. Each step must use the full output from the previous step. Ensure the desired word/scene counts are always reached. No exceptions. Return in this exact order. Script scenes. Hook. Show more. Thought process. Thought process. I lost 2 warriors of my company during that transit to ambushes by warbands I did not recognize. Warriors who wore no Legion colors and bore mutations so advanced that I could not identify their origin faction. I killed their killers and continued moving. The message remained in my mind like a lit coal, radiating a warmth I had not felt in centuries. The world that waited at the end of the journey was not what I had expected. Asphodel. The name means nothing from the outside. From orbit, it looked like a wound in the surface of a continental mass, a massive circular pattern carved into the entire northern landmass of the planet, concentric rings of dark stone and compacted bone material that spiraled inward toward a central point where the warp energy was so dense that it appeared as a physical discoloration of the atmosphere, a bruise in the air, approximately 3 kilometers across, that my enhanced vision could not fully resolve into component parts. The orbit around Asphodel was crowded with warships. I had not seen this many vessels gathered in one location since the Siege of Terra. Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, Death Guard, Word Bearers, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, Thousand Sons. Every surviving traitor legion represented, their ships bearing the accumulated marks of 10,000 years of warp corruption in forms that made the original vessel classifications nearly unrecognizable. Dozens of smaller warbands whose marks I could not immediately identify occupied the orbital gaps between the Legion vessels, their ships smaller and stranger, shaped by the eye's influence into configurations that no shipwright in any civilization had ever designed. The gathering was unprecedented. To assemble this many hostile factions in a single location without mutual destruction required either a threat so enormous that it suppressed all individual grievance, or a name so resonant that it bypassed 10,000 years of accumulated hatred and reminded every survivor what they had originally been fighting for. It was both. I descended to the surface and found Vexarath standing at the edge of the third concentric ring, looking inward at the central point where the warp energy churned and shifted like a living organism, trying to remember the shape of something it had once contained. He had been first captain of the Sons of Horus before I was recruited, which made him roughly 150 years older than me in biological terms, and consequently more thoroughly marked by everything the eye had done to Astartes' physiology over the millennia. He stood in sea-green armor that bore the worn markings of uncountable campaigns, 7 feet of transhuman will that had refused to be consumed by 10,000 years of everything the Immaterium could throw at it. The left side of his face carried the architecture of a man who had survived too many things that no man was meant to survive. His eyes were still green. That mattered more than it might seem. In the eye, the color of a man's eyes tells you whether his mind has held. He told me what they were attempting. He told me over the course of 6 hours, standing in one place, not moving, his gaze fixed on the central point of the ritual site, where the warp energy churned and compressed, and reached and pulled. What he described was the product of 3 centuries of research conducted independently by 4 different chaos sorcerers who had not been in communication with each other and had nonetheless reached the same theoretical conclusion through different chains of reasoning, which was itself a sign of how the warp sometimes decides what it wants to be known. The conclusion was precise and staggering in equal measure. A soul that has been consumed and shattered rather than destroyed outright does not cease to exist. It fragments. The fragments drift in the immaterium, too small to be located individually, too dispersed to coalesce naturally, but persistent. Indestructible in a way that whole souls are not, because there is nothing small enough to destroy a fragment and nothing large enough to contain one. Fragments, 10,000 years old, still carrying the resonance of what they had once composed. What they had once composed was Horus Lupercal, the war master, the arch-traitor, the greatest military commander in human history, and all 4 chaos gods had agreed to bring him back. I made Vexarath repeat that sentence. He repeated it without hesitation and without any indication that he shared my difficulty believing it. Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle and Slaanesh, 4 beings of cosmological scale whose mutual antagonism is older than the human species and more structural than any particular grievance between them, had agreed to pool their power and their will in service of a single objective, which was the reconstruction of a soul that none of them individually owned and all of them individually coveted. The logic was not one of affection or alliance. The logic was one of investment and calculated return. Each of the 4 had determined, in whatever manner beings of that magnitude perform determinations, that Horus Lupercal, returned to the material realm, was more valuable than any alternative they could achieve independently, and that allowing any single one of them to claim his return exclusively would cost the other 3 more than cooperation was worth. The result of this calculation was something that had not happened in all of recorded history. The 4 ruinous powers, acting in unison. The ritual had been running for 4 years by the time I arrived at Asphodel. The soul fragments were being gathered the way you gather ash after a fire, one piece at a time, drawn from the dispersed currents of the immaterium by sorcery of a scale that required the continuous sustained effort of 47 warp-touched practitioners working in rotating shifts without rest, maintaining a concentration of psychic energy at the central point of the ritual site that was visibly consuming them even as they sustained it. The power that flowed through the site was perceptible to my enhanced senses as a discoloration of the air, a heat that had nothing to do with temperature, a pressure on the back of my skull that intensified with each meter I walked toward the innermost ring. At the central point itself, where the senior sorcerers worked, I was told the pressure was sufficient to collapse the secondary organs of an unaugmented human without any other force being applied. Several of the lesser practitioners had simply dissolved over the course of the ritual's duration, their physical forms insufficient to sustain the channel of power they had been designated to maintain. They had given their lives to this willingly. The smell of the ritual site was copper and burning, and something older than both, something that had no name in any material language, but that the hindbrain recognized as the scent of something impossibly significant occurring in close proximity. I took my position at the outer ring and waited. The waiting lasted 2 years. I want to be precise about what those 2 years were like, because the time had a particular quality that I have not experienced at any other point in 10,000 years of residence in the Eye. It was time spent in proximity to something gathering itself. The ritual's energy did not remain constant during those years. It built, measurably and continuously, in the way that pressure builds in an enclosed space when something inside it is slowly increasing in heat. Every day, or what passed for days on Asphodel, the central point was marginally more present, marginally more real, marginally more insistent in its demand on the attention of everything in its vicinity. The warriors camped in the concentric rings around it felt it in different ways, according to their natures. The World Eaters grew quieter, which for World Eaters is a more significant change than it sounds. The Emperor's children grew more intensely focused on sensation, as though the ritual's building energy was feeding whatever in them responded to stimulus. The sons of Horus, those of us who remained closest to our original natures, simply watched and felt the thing that lived behind our sternum growing heavier with each passing week. We were waiting for someone. The fact of that waiting was itself something I had not experienced since the crusade. To wait for a specific person, rather than for a tactical situation, or a strategic development, or the resolution of a warp storm, or any of the other impersonal things that warriors in the eye spend their time waiting for, was to engage with a particular quality of anticipation that I had believed 10,000 years had permanently extinguished in me. I was wrong. The anticipation was there, behind the stone I keep in the river of my memory, behind all the careful management of expectation that very long survival in very hostile conditions produces in a mind that intends to remain coherent. It was the anticipation of someone who knew what they had lost and was being told it was coming back, and who was not yet certain whether coming back would mean the same thing it had meant before. I spent those 2 years reviewing everything I remembered about him. The memories were older than most civilizations. They had the quality that very old memories acquire, which is not fading exactly, but a kind of crystallization, a settling into certain essential images that represent larger sequences of experience. I remembered his voice giving orders that made formations that had been losing suddenly understand how to win. I remembered his face at the mural in the Legion Chapel on the Vengeful Spirit, looking at the image of the Emperor with an expression I had never been able to fully decode, something between reverence and grief, and something else that only became comprehensible in retrospect. I remembered the day above Davin when the reports came through that something had happened to him aboard the Delphos, that the War Master had been wounded and taken to the surface for healing at a serpent lodge of obscure local practice, and the particular quality of unease that had moved through the Legion like a change in atmospheric pressure, something wrong at a level that no one could yet articulate. I remembered terror. I have always remembered terror, in the way that you always remember the thing that ends a particular version of your life and begins whatever comes next. The sky above the palace burning, the Vox traffic that stopped making sense in the final hours. The moment when the thing that I described as pressure behind my sternum collapsed outward into an absence, a sudden and total removal of something I had been orienting my existence around, without consciously recognizing how completely I had been doing so. He was gone. And then, 2 years into the waiting at Asphodel, he was not. The change began 3 days before it completed, which was enough time for every being on and around the planet to register that something was shifting, but not enough time to prepare for what the shift would mean. The warp energy at the central point, which had been building steadily for years, began building at a rate that dispensed with the previous pace entirely, accelerating through magnitudes that the outer ring's monitoring sorcerers could not quantify quickly enough to keep current with. The 47 practitioners at the center began to collapse, not from injury but from the completion of expenditure, from the arrival at the point where there was nothing left in them to give, and the process they had been sustaining had achieved the threshold of self-sustaining coherence, and no longer required their maintenance. They fell where they stood and lay without moving, alive in the minimal technical sense of the word, and the ritual continued. The warriors in the outer rings had moved to standing positions without any command being given. The pressure behind my skull became something that had difficulty fitting in the space behind my skull. The 40,000 gathered souls on and around Asphodel became collectively, absolutely silent. On the final day, in the hours before completion, the sky above the ritual site changed color, not the color the eye's sky normally was, which is already a color that no material sky should produce. It changed to all 4 simultaneously, a quartered spectrum that corresponded to nothing in the material universe's optical physics and everything in the immaterium's symbolic logic. Korn's red in the north, Tzeentch's shifting impossible spectrum in the east, Nurgle's deep saturated green in the west, Slaaneish's iridescent pale in the south. The 4 sectors of the sky met at the zenith directly above the ritual site's center point, and the meeting place was a color that I still cannot name, because it did not have a name before that moment, and nothing that has happened since has given me occasion to develop one. Then the central point contracted. Where the warp energy field had been a diffuse shimmer 3 kilometers across for 2 years of ritual operation, it pulled itself inward over the course of approximately 4 seconds into a point of concentration so dense that looking directly at it produced a sensation in my enhanced vision that I would describe as the visual equivalent of hearing a sound too loud for the ear to process, a kind of protective interruption rather than damage. And then the point expanded outward with a force that I felt in my chest as a percussion that had no sound component, a purely physical pressure wave that moved through the air and through the stone beneath my boots and through my armor and through the transhuman body inside the armor, a wave that communicated not destruction but announcement, not violence but arrival. The smoke cleared. The thing that stood in the center of the ritual site was facing away from me. I had approximately 4 seconds of observation before the scale of what I was looking at began to process in any coherent sequence. The figure was taller than I remembered, and my memory of Horus Lupercal is the memory of a being who had never needed to be taller than he was to fill any space he occupied. The reconstruction had added something to the physical form, some increase in mass and height that was not incidental to the process but consequential to it, as though 10,000 years of dissolution in the immaterium had not diminished the original but concentrated it, had reduced it to essence, and then restored the essence in a form that was more purely itself than the original life had been. He wore no armor. He stood in his own reconstituted flesh, and the marks were immediately visible from where I was positioned. Not one mark, all 4. The brand of corn at the base of his neck, raised and scarlet and precise, a marking that contained in its geometry the entire logic of that god's relationship with violence and blood and the martial absolute. Across his right shoulder, the shifting labyrinthine sigil of Tzinch, colors that could not decide what they were from moment to moment, a pattern that resolved into different configurations every time I thought I had identified its stable form. On his left hand, the mark of Nurgle, not rot and not decay, but something that looked more like growth, like the patient, deliberate pressure of something that tends rather than consumes, a mark that in the moment I saw it communicated more clearly than anything else how thoroughly the process of his reconstruction had involved all 4 patrons equally. And along his jaw, the mark of Slanesh, a single fine line, the most elegant of the 4, and consequently the most unsettling, as though the Prince of Pleasure had understood that restraint was the most effective form of presence in this particular context. He bore all 4. Then he turned, and I saw his face, and I have tried many times in the years since that moment to describe what his face communicated when it completed that turn to face the 40,000 who had gathered in anticipation of this moment. I have never found an adequate description, so I will tell you what I observed, rather than what it meant. His eyes contained all 4 colors simultaneously. This is not metaphor. Where a human eye or an Astartes eye shows a single iris of defined and stable color, his eyes held 4 at once, a quartered arrangement that should have produced revulsion and instead produced something closer to recognition, as though this was what eyes had always been intended to be, and everything before it had been a preliminary approximation. The structure of his face was the structure I remembered, the jaw and the brow and the particular geometry of a face that had been called beautiful in its original life without being softened by that beauty. He had looked like a conqueror in life. He looked like something larger than a conqueror now, something that included the conqueror but was not limited to it. He looked at us. He looked at 40,000 warriors gathered in concentric rings around the site of his reconstruction, warriors who had fought and killed and survived and corrupted and diminished themselves across 10 millennia in the scattered continuation of a war he had started, and the expression on his face was not what I had expected. I had expected recognition, the kind that comes with assessment and selection, some and familiar and some and new. I had expected judgment, the War Master weighing what had been done with his absence and finding it wanting. I had expected fury, which was what the warp had been promising was coming for years in anticipation of this moment. What I saw instead was something quieter and more frightening. He looked at us the way a man looks at a problem he has been turning over in his mind for a very long time, and has finally identified the correct first step toward a solution. Not with fresh outrage, not with the burning urgency of someone confronting an injury for the first time, with the calm, considered attention of someone who has had 10,000 years of formless dissolution in the immaterium to think about what he would do when he had a body again, and has arrived at answers that no longer require anger to motivate them. He said 4 words. His voice was exactly the same as the recordings I had preserved in my memory across 10 millennia. The resonance, and the authority, and the particular quality of certainty that had made lesser beings feel that disagreement with it was not an option worth considering. The voice of the Great Crusade. The voice that had convinced half the legions that the Emperor's vision for humanity's future was replaceable with something better. That voice, restored without diminishment, coming out of a body marked by all 4 gods of chaos and belonging to no single one of them, was one of the most disorienting things I had experienced since the Siege of Terror. He said, "We did not finish." 4 words. No greeting, no acknowledgement of 10,000 years, no expression of gratitude toward the thousands who had worked toward his return, no invocation of the gods who had made it possible, no ceremony and no theater, just the statement of an interrupted project that intended to continue. Vexarath, standing 5 meters to my left, made a sound I had never heard from him before. It was very small, and he concealed it immediately, and in the noise of 40,000 warriors beginning to react to the sight of the Warmaster restored, no one else heard it, but I was close enough. It was something between relief and grief, and it told me that he had spent 4 centuries preparing for this moment without being certain that the being who arrived would be Horus, and now that Horus was here, the certainty of it was larger than he had prepared himself to bear. I understood completely. The 40,000 warriors around me were not cheering. This surprised me in the first moments before I understood why. You might expect cheering, the return of the Warmaster, the restoration of the being who had come within a single combat of defeating the Emperor of mankind, should have produced a response of some significant emotional force from warriors who had spent 10,000 years fighting in his name without his presence. What it produced instead was silence. The kind of silence that follows something too large to process immediately. The kind of silence that comes before the mind catches up to what the eyes have confirmed. Then a World Eater's berserker, in red and brass armor, raised his weapon and screamed. The silence broke. What followed in the first hours after the ritual completion was the only time in my years of observing Horus at this stage that I saw something that resembled disorientation in him, though disorientation is not quite the correct word. It was more like calibration. The transition from the immaterium to a physical body after 10,000 years of dissolution is something that no other being had ever performed at this magnitude, and the physical reality of having a body again, of operating through matter rather than through pure energy and will, required a period of adjustment that was visible only to those watching very closely. He moved through the ritual site in those first hours with deliberate care, examining his hands, pressing his palm against the stone surface of the inner ring, looking at the sky and the warships in orbit and the assembled thousands, with the attention of someone confirming that the information being provided by their senses corresponds to what they had expected. The worlds were not the same worlds they had been 10,000 years ago. The galaxy he was returning to was not the galaxy he had left. He knew this. He had known it from within the warp where 10 millennia of the material universe's events had been perceptible to him in the way that events in a house are perceptible to someone listening through a wall, muffled and incomplete but present. He had not been absent from the history. He had been unable to act within it. He was acting within it now. The days that followed the ritual completion were unlike anything I had observed in 10,000 years of residence in the Eye. Horus did not rest. This was the first and most immediately significant thing I noticed about him in those early hours and days after his return. He had just been reconstituted from fragments scattered across the immaterium by a ritual that had consumed the combined power of all 4 chaos gods and the sustained sacrifice of 47 practitioners, and he did not rest. He moved through the assembled forces at Asphodel with the directness of a commander who has a timeline and understands the value of every hour. He spoke to the surviving legion commanders first, the oldest and most senior warriors who had known him before his death, and I was not present for those initial conversations, but I watched the men who came out of them, and what I saw on their faces was not the expression of men who had received orders from a superior. It was the expression of men who had just been shown how a problem they had been trying to solve for millennia was supposed to be approached, and who understood now that everything they had attempted in the interim was approximately correct in direction, but wrong in scale. He was brought to me on the 4th day. I had not requested an audience. He had sent for me, which told me either that Vexarath had included me in a briefing of relevant surviving personnel, or that Horus had spent part of his first 4 days of restoration reviewing the available information on the veterans assembled at Asphodel and identifying those whose histories made them significant for reasons he had not yet disclosed. Either possibility was equally characteristic of him. He received me in the central point of the ritual site. The sorcery was gone, dispersed at the moment of completion, and the space was simply a 3-kilometer circle of dark stone with the burned-in marks of immense power distributed across its surface in patterns that would persist as long as the world endured. He was studying one of those burned marks when I arrived, with the focused attention of a man reading a text that interested him, and he did not immediately acknowledge my arrival, and I did not announce myself, because the protocol of presenting yourself to Horus Lupercal had not changed in 10,000 years, and I had not forgotten it. You waited until he chose to address you. He chose after approximately 2 minutes. He said my name, not with ceremony, just with the precision of a man confirming the correct name for the correct face before proceeding to what he actually wanted to discuss. He asked me what the Imperium looked like now. The question startled me, which was itself startling, because I had believed I was past the age of being startled by anything. He had spent 10,000 years in the Immaterium, which is not a place from which you receive current events briefings in any reliable or structured form, and his question was the question of a commander who understands that every operation begins with intelligence, and that 10 millennia of institutional knowledge acquired during the Crusade and the Heresy is not a reliable map of the galaxy as it currently exists. He wanted to know what had changed, not the largest things, not the cicatrix maledictum whose formation he had felt from within the warp and which he described briefly in terms that made it clear he understood its structural implications better than most material beings who had watched it form, but the texture of the Imperium, how it governed, how it fought, what its doctrines were, what had broken in it over 10,000 years, and what had held, and what had mutated beyond recognition under the pressure of decay and endless war. I talked for 11 hours. He listened without interruption and without apparent fatigue, and asked questions that revealed very quickly that 10,000 years in the warp had not touched the intelligence. If anything, the dissolution had refined it. He did not ask questions to fill gaps in his knowledge. He asked questions to test the edges of conclusions he had already reached, to find where his models of the current situation diverged from my direct experience, and to update them accordingly. He was, as he had always been, the best strategic mind I had ever encountered, and what the 10 millennia had added to that intelligence was a quality of detachment from individual outcome that had not been present in his original life. He had always been capable of strategic sacrifice, of committing forces to positions that could not be held because the holding of them served a larger purpose. Now there was something in his assessment of such calculations that was more absolute, more patient, less burdened by the particular emotional weight of losing men he had known by name. The gods had changed him. They had not removed him. That was the critical understanding, and I reached it in those 11 hours of conversation with a clarity I have not been able to improve upon since. Horus Lupercal was present in that body, in that voice, in the strategic intelligence and the particular quality of attention he gave to problems that mattered. But the dissolution had stripped away some intermediate layer between the War Master and the full depth of what he had become in the warp, and what remained was both more and less than the being I had followed to Terra. More, in the sense of depth and patience, and the kind of understanding that only beings who have been dissolved and rebuilt possess. Less, in the sense of the particular human griefs and urgencies and loyalties that had made his original self the specific creature it was, rather than a general category of excellence. I did not know yet whether to call that better or worse. The decision to move was made on the 9th day after the ritual. I was present for the senior council that assembled in the burned circle of the ritual site under a sky that was, by the standards of Asphodel and the Eye in general, unusually stable. 12 individuals, veterans of both the heresy and the Long War, representing the major factions that had assembled. Vexarath for the sons of Horus, a world-eater's lord called Kratos, whose skull mark implants had been growing outward through the plates of his armor for 4,000 years, giving him the appearance of a man being slowly consumed by his own ambition made physical. A creature from the Emperor's children who had once been a legion champion and was now something that retained the form of an Astartes while inhabiting that form with a presence that was not entirely situated in the material universe at any given moment. Representatives from the other legions, each carrying their own 10 millennia of transformation in the way they stood and spoke and related to the space around them. Horus spoke for 2 hours. He did not speak the way commanders speak at morale gatherings, with inspiration and invocation and the crafted cadences of language designed to produce emotional responses in the listener. He spoke the way engineers discuss structural problems, with precision and acknowledgement of difficulty and a consistent focus on solution rather than sentiment. He laid out the strategic situation as he understood it, which was the strategic situation of the Long War as conducted by forces that had spent 10,000 years fighting without consistent coordination, without a unified objective, without the kind of campaign planning that his original crusade had demonstrated was the difference between military action and military purpose. He told us what we had been doing wrong. He told us without contempt and without the implication that doing wrong was the consequence of any failure of intelligence or will. He told us the way you tell someone that they have been pushing against a door that opens inward, not with condemnation of the pushing, but with the directional correction that changes everything. The Chaos forces had been fighting the Imperium the way water fights a stone, constantly and everywhere and without specific objective, wearing down what could be worn down and crashing against what could not. He wanted to fight it the way an engineer addresses a structure, with understanding of where the load-bearing elements are and where the removal of one element initiates cascading failure through the whole. He had 3 targets. I am not going to describe what those targets were, partly because the knowledge remains operationally sensitive in ways that matter even now, partly because what happened in the weeks and months that followed made 2 of the 3 targets irrelevant in the way that all preliminary objectives become irrelevant when the actual objective comes into sufficient focus. What I will tell you is that all 3 were chosen not for symbolic value or for the psychological effect that striking them would have on Imperial morale, but for specific structural significance, for the particular function each served in the machinery of the Imperium's continued operation, and the specific cascade of failures that their elimination would initiate. He had spent 10,000 years in the warp, which is also the space where the Emperor's will and psychic architecture interface with the material universe, and what he had learned there about the Imperium's actual load-bearing elements was something that no enemy of the Imperium had ever possessed in this form or with this precision. He knew, in a way that was almost architectural, exactly where to push. The Council agreed. This was not a unanimous expression of enthusiasm. Kratos had objections relating to the scale of the first stage, which he believed was insufficiently aggressive relative to the force available and the momentum of the moment. The Emperor's children representative had concerns that were more aesthetic than tactical and consequently more difficult to address because they were not entirely expressible in the vocabulary of ordinary military planning. The representative from the Alpha Legion was silent throughout the discussion, which told me nothing, because the Alpha Legion is always silent throughout everything and yet always somehow knows what is happening before it happens. None of the objections were sufficient to constitute meaningful dissent, and none of the objecting parties had any interest in being the commander who stood against the War Master on the 9th day of his return. We began moving within 48 hours of that council, 40,000 warriors, over 200 warships, the largest coordinated chaos force assembled since the 13th Black Crusade, and organized with a coherence and command structure that crusade had conspicuously lacked. We moved through the Eye toward the remnant of the Cadian Gate, navigating the ways that the Cicatrix Maledictum had created in what had previously been the primary exit routes from the Immaterium. Horus navigated those routes himself, personally directing the transit, using knowledge of the warp's current geography that he had acquired during his 10,000 years of dissolution in a way that no living navigator possessed. The eye, during that transit, behaved differently than I had experienced in 10 millennia of travel through it. The warp stepped aside. I have heard sorcerers offer several explanations for this. The simplest one, offered by the oldest and most experienced of the eye's long-term residents, is that the immaterium recognized what was moving through it and chose not to test itself against that recognition. Whatever the explanation, the transit was direct and without incident in a way that transit through the eye simply is not, and we crossed from the immaterium into real space at a point 30 light-years from what had been Cadia, with a speed and directness that should have been impossible. The sensation of the transition back to real space is one that veterans of the Long War process differently from those who have not made the crossing. For those with experience, it is a disorientation with a known endpoint, a period of recalibration as the senses adjust to the loss of the immaterium's ambient pressure and the gain of real space's comparative silence. For those who had spent too many continuous years in the eye, it produced incapacitation ranging from nausea to brief unconsciousness. Horus had accounted for this in the composition of the vanguard, placing only veteran forces in the first wave and holding the more warp-immersed elements in reserve until the initial position in real space was established. He had thought of everything. This was what I kept observing in those early hours in real space, the relentless completeness of his preparation. Every contingency I could identify had already been addressed. Every force composition question I could formulate had an answer already built into the deployment structure. He had spent the 3-month transit from Asphodel to the Eye's Edge building an operational plan of a complexity that would have required a staff of hundreds of senior officers working in sustained coordination to produce in any normal military organization. He had produced it alone, or rather he had produced it with the assistance of whatever 10,000 years in the warp had left him access to, which appeared to include a comprehensive awareness of real space military dispositions that I could not entirely account for through any ordinary intelligence-gathering mechanism. I asked him once how he knew where the Imperial Navy patrols were positioned. He told me that the warp is the space where the Imperium's communications infrastructure lives, and that a being who has spent 10,000 years in the warp without the limitation of a physical body to constrain their attention has had considerable opportunity to listen. The Imperium did not know we were coming. This is the first thing I want to be precise about, because the distinction matters for everything that followed. The scale of the force emerging from the eye attracted detection, of course. Imperial listening posts in the region of the former Cadian Gate are not the most sophisticated military intelligence infrastructure in the galaxy, but they are sufficient to register the electromagnetic and psychic signature of 200 Chaos warships entering real space simultaneously, and the alerts went out within hours of our transition. What the Imperium did not know was what it had detected: a Chaos incursion of unusual scale, perhaps another in the tradition of the Black Crusades, though the Black Crusades have historically announced themselves through years or decades of preliminary warp storm intensification and coordinated cult activity that gives the Imperium warning before any significant force emerges from the eye. This had none of those signatures, no preliminary storms, no synchronized cult uprisings across the affected sectors, no years of gathering psychic pressure preceding the emergence, just a force, arriving suddenly, with no precedent in the established pattern. The astropathic network registered it differently. I learned this later, through intelligence sources I will not specify, but what happened in the Imperium's psychic infrastructure at the moment we crossed from the eye into real space was something that had not occurred since the heresy itself. The astropaths across the sectors adjacent to the Cadian Gate felt a pressure wave in the psychic medium that registered not as the usual chaotic noise of chaos activity in that region, but as something with a specific and ancient resonance, a frequency that some of the oldest and most attuned among them recognized, without being able to immediately identify what they recognized, the way you can recognize a face from childhood in the face of a stranger who happens to share the bone structure. They screamed. Many of them screamed, Not in the way that astropaths scream when subjected to psychic attack, but in the way that beings scream when they encounter something that their training has not prepared them to process. The choir at the nearest major installation lost 3 practitioners to catatonia within the first hour of our emergence. The Astronomicon flickered. This is the detail that reached Gilliman, not the warships emerging from the eye, which was a military threat of considerable but manageable scale even at 200 vessels, not the screaming astropaths, which was alarming but not unprecedented, given the cicatrix maledictum's ongoing effect on the psychic medium across the affected sectors. The Astronomicon's flicker was the detail that reached him, because in 10,000 years of continuous operation, the psychic beacon generated by the Emperor's sacrifice in the Golden Throne had never flickered, not once, not during any of the Black Crusades, not during the formation of the Great Rift, not during the worst moments of any catastrophe that had struck the Imperium across the millennia. The Astronomicon had been the one constant in a galaxy that had otherwise been in continuous and accelerating decay, the fixed point around which the navigation of a civilization spanning 100,000 worlds was organized. It flickered for 9 seconds, then it resumed, fully powered, as though nothing had occurred. Our first engagement was with an Imperial monitoring station positioned approximately 20 light-years from our emergence point. They were not prepared for what arrived in their system. They were equipped and positioned to observe the region and relay intelligence, capable of defending themselves against the smaller predatory forces that periodically tested the perimeter of the eye's influence in this area, not capable of meaningful resistance against a force of our scale and composition. What mattered was not the station's military capability, but the decision Horus made about what to do with it. He did not destroy it. This was the first surprise, and it recalibrated my understanding of what his return meant more thoroughly than any of the preceding evidence. A chaos force of this scale, emerging from the eye, with the combined mass of every traitor warband that had assembled at Asphodel, should have destroyed an Imperial monitoring station in the path of its advance as a matter of course, as a statement, as the opening note of a particular kind of martial music that establishes what kind of campaign is underway. Horus ordered the station seized. He ordered it taken intact, its communication systems disabled rather than destroyed, its crew captured rather than killed, its intelligence archives extracted in full before any equipment was damaged. He wanted information more than he wanted the statement of violence. He spent 2 days in the station personally. He read everything. He questioned the prisoners himself, and the questioning was not what the Emperor's children would have made it, not what the World Eaters would have made it, not the theatrical cruelty that the Long War had turned into a default mode for prisoner interaction on the Chaos side. He questioned them with the efficiency of someone who knows precisely what he needs and understands how to extract it, without destroying the source's utility. Most of the prisoners he released. He gave them one of the station's emergency evacuation craft and sent them back into Imperial space, and the consternation this produced among several of the warband commanders who had expected a different resolution, was handled with the brevity he applied to all internal dissent, which was a sentence or two of explanation that made argument feel like it would require more intelligence to sustain than the objecting party wished to display. The released prisoners would return to Imperial space and report what they had seen. Their reports would be accurate, because they had seen accurately, and the Imperium would respond to those accurate reports with the military force that the scale of what had been reported warranted. That was the point. He wanted the Imperium to deploy forces calibrated to what it believed was occurring. He wanted them looking at the size of the thing they could see. He did not want them to understand, yet, the nature of the mind directing it. The second engagement was different in the way that his campaigns always differentiated themselves from the approach that preceded them. 3 weeks after the monitoring station, a significant Imperial battle group intercepted our vanguard force at the edge of a system whose inhabited world was a hive planet of no specific strategic value beyond its position in the regional resupply network. The battle group was 47 warships commanded by an admiral whose tactical deployment I assessed, through the quality of his formation choices, as being above average for Imperial naval command in this era. Above average was not enough. Horus had anticipated the deployment geometry of the battle group before it had finished forming. He had arranged our forces to present an appearance of poorly coordinated aggressive advance, the kind of disorganized forward pressure that chaos forces produce when they are driven by enthusiasm rather than planning, which is how they fight most of the time, which is why they lose most of the time. The admiral read the apparent disorganization and responded with a formation that maximized his firepower concentration at the point of expected engagement. This was the correct response to the formation he believed he was facing. It was the catastrophically incorrect response to the formation that was actually there, because the reserves Horus had positioned in the 17 hours before the engagement began were not in any location the admiral's pre-battle scans had searched, running at minimal power signatures in vectors that would have required the admiral to consider a different threat model than the one historical precedent had provided him. The battle lasted 4 hours. Of the 47 Imperial warships, 6 escaped. The rest were destroyed or taken. I watched the engagement unfold from the flagship's command deck, and I watched Horus watching it. And what I saw on his face during those 4 hours was the first clear expression of something approaching satisfaction that I had observed since his return. Not the savage satisfaction of the world eaters, not the refined aesthetic pleasure of the Emperor's children, something that predated both of those registers. The pure and unaffected satisfaction of a mind operating at its full capability, of a commander whose plan is working precisely because it was the right plan and not merely because his enemies were insufficient. He was doing what he was made to do, and watching him do it was the closest I had come since the Crusade to understanding what it had meant to follow him. I remained afraid of what he had become. The two things were not contradictory. The news reached Guilliman in stages, and each stage was worse than the one before it. The first stage was the monitoring station, significant, unusual, not alarming in isolation, though the method of the operation was sufficiently distinct from normal chaos patterns to generate a priority intelligence assessment. The second stage was the battle group. 41 warships destroyed or taken in 4 hours, with a tactical sophistication that the subsequent after-action review described in terms that caused 3 of the reviewing admirals to request reassignment, because the implication of what they were reading was something none of them wanted to be responsible for acting on. The third stage was the prisoner reports. The released prisoners from the monitoring station arrived in Imperial space and filed their accounts, and the accounts were accurate and detailed, and they described a force of unprecedented coordination and a campaign of unusual restraint by any standard applicable to chaos operations. No civilian casualties, no wanton destruction. Infrastructure taken intact rather than burned, a campaign that looked, to eyes trained on 10,000 years of chaos operational patterns, like something that was trying to accomplish a specific and considered objective, rather than to destroy and terrify everything in its path. Guilliman read the accounts. He read the battle group after-action review. He then received, separately and in a secured location with minimal staff and no formal record, the full assessment that a senior librarian of the Ultramarines had delivered privately 3 weeks earlier. The assessment that described the psychic resonance signature of the emerging force in terms that matched only one being who had ever produced it in the history of the Immaterium's contact with the material realm. He spent 4 hours alone after reading that assessment. I know what he was doing in those 4 hours, because I know Robert Guilliman, not personally, not in the way that Horus knew him during the Crusade, when they had been brothers, in the complicated and contingent way that the Primarchs were brothers, which was a brotherhood built on shared purpose and sustained by the respect that very large intelligences extend across disagreements rather than despite them. I know him from 10,000 years of reading the history of his decisions, which is the only way that enemies in a very long war eventually come to know each other with any genuine accuracy. He is methodical. He does not allow emotion to precede analysis. He was doing in those 4 hours what he does whenever he encounters a problem too large to immediately act upon, which is to build a complete model of the situation in his mind before permitting himself to feel what the situation means. He would have built the model, and then he would have felt what it meant. What it meant was this: the being who had come closer to ending the Imperium than any other force in history, closer than the Tyranid hive fleets, closer than the Necron dynasties, closer than the great rift that had split the galaxy in half, was back, reconstituted and altered, bearing the marks of all four Chaos gods while serving the purposes of none of them exclusively, commanding the largest coordinated Chaos military force in centuries, having just demonstrated in a 4-hour engagement that his strategic capability was exactly what the historical record said it had been, and the Astronomicon had flickered for 9 seconds upon his emergence, which was not a coincidence and not a malfunction, and not something that Guilliman, of all beings in the current Imperium, would be likely to misattribute. He mobilized everything. The scope of what Guilliman assembled in the weeks following his 4 hours of solitary reckoning was, by any measure I had access to through our intelligence picture, extraordinary. He drew on every contingency reserve the Imperium maintained. He accelerated the return of Indomitus Crusade elements from peripheral theaters at a pace that required him to negotiate directly with chapter masters who were in the middle of their own campaigns and who did not welcome interruption. He coordinated with the Custodian Guard through channels that bypassed normal institutional hierarchies. He requested and received a degree of inter-chapter cooperation that represented a drawing on political capital that he had spent a century accumulating and had not previously used in a single operation. He was not deploying a force to stop a Chaos incursion. He was assembling everything because he understood, or was beginning to understand, what we were. The campaign accelerated in the weeks following the battle group engagement, and the quality of the forces we encountered changed with every system we passed through in ways that told me, without any intelligence briefing being necessary, that we were approaching something Guilliman was personally defending rather than institutionally managing. Chapter masters appeared, forces without standard designations that operated without normal imperial insignia, and that the custodians moved among in formations that were designed less for direct engagement than for presence and observation. They did not stop us. They made themselves seen. Guilliman was letting us know he was watching. I reported this to Horus. He received it without visible reaction, then asked me to find Vexarath. Vexarath had been less present in the campaign's later phases than he had been at Asphodel. The ritual and its 4-century preparation had cost him things that I had not fully quantified in the busy months of the campaign, and the old first captain of the Sons of Horus had begun showing the signs of someone who has given everything they had to a single purpose and is existing in the aftermath of it, not diminished exactly but quieted, the slightly reduced quality of his attention, the longer pauses before responding to direct questions, the tendency to stand in observation ports for extended periods looking at nothing in particular, with an expression that in a lesser man I would have described as wondering whether it had been worth it. I found him looking at the void and told him Horus wanted him. He came without a word. The conversation between them was private, and I was not present, and I will not speculate about its content. What I observed was that Vexarath emerged from it with a quality of resolution on his face that had been absent in the preceding weeks, something that looked like a man who has made peace with an accounting he had been dreading. He spoke to me briefly afterward. He said, "He remembers everything." I asked what he meant. He said, "Every battle I fought in 400 years to make that ritual possible, every negotiation, every sacrifice, every soldier, I spent on something that should have failed and did not fail. He knows all of it. He knows everything I did, and he said it mattered." He did not say anything more. On the 43rd day of the final approach, we reached the orbit of Terra. The last 3 days of that approach had been through a corridor of Imperial forces that had chosen to allow our passage rather than engage, not from tactical concession to our strength alone, but from something that I slowly understood was a deliberate decision made at the highest level of Imperial authority. They were not letting us through because they could not stop us. They were letting us through because Guilliman had decided that whatever was happening was not going to resolve through the kind of engagement that happens when 2 fleets occupy the same spatial volume and attempt to destroy each other. He had decided that the appropriate response to what we were was a conversation rather than a battle, and he had made the dispositions necessary to ensure that the conversation could occur in the location where it needed to occur. He met us through a secured communication channel that opened between our flagship and his, without any preliminary contact, without any request or acknowledgement of the request from our side, simply opening in a way that demonstrated it had been prepared and waiting for exactly this moment. He had known we would reach Terra orbit. He had prepared the channel before we arrived. The communication was witnessed by both command elements and by me. Gilliman said, "Brother." The word fell into the silence between the two ends of the channel with a weight I had not anticipated. Horus was still for a moment. Then he said, with the same voice he had always had, "Reboot." What followed was a conversation that I have tried to write down accurately many times, and that I will try once more now. Gilliman said he knew why Horus was there. Horus confirmed he was not there to fight. Gilliman said he had known that for some time, and that the difficulty was whether what Horus was there to do was possible at all, and whether it was something he could permit regardless of what it might mean. Horus said he wanted to see the Emperor. Gilliman said the Emperor could not speak. Horus said he knew that, and that he needed to go anyway, because he had spent 10,000 years in the warp learning what the Emperor thought, and he needed to know whether what he believed he had learned was what the Emperor would choose to confirm if confirmation were available. Silence on the channel. Long silence. Gilliman said, "If I allow you near the throne, there is no guarantee that what the gods have made of you will not respond to that proximity in ways that damage it." Horus said, "You are right. There is no guarantee. But I want to ask you to consider something. I spent 10,000 years dissolving in the place where the Emperor's own psychic will is most present, and the gods assembled me from the original fragments of what I was before the dissolution. And what I was before the dissolution, Reboot, before Davin, and before the heresy, and before the siege, was someone who loved him." The silence that followed that sentence lasted longer than any silence I had experienced in a conversation. Then Gilliman said, "Give me 3 hours." He closed the channel. In the 3 hours that followed, our force held position in high Terra orbit without engagement, watched by an Imperial fleet that also held without engagement. 2 vast armadas, occupying the same orbital space in something that was not peace and was not war, but was the most significant pause in the history of the Long War. I walked the flagship's decks. I found Vexarath at an observation port looking at the blue and green curve of Terra below us, and I stood beside him without speaking for a time. He said, without looking away from the planet, "I was born in this system, Chthoniya. You cannot see it from here. The world is gone. But this is the closest I have been to where I started." I said, "I know." He said, "Whatever happens now, we came back." I said, "We did." The channel opened again at the end of the 3 hours. Gilliman said, "Come down." I was not permitted to accompany Horus to the surface, and I had not expected to be. The arrangement was a private one in the only sense that mattered, which was that it involved only the 2 parties who needed to be present, and whose presence at all required the kind of trust that is not extended to adjutants, regardless of their history. Horus descended to Terra with a custodian escort that never left his immediate proximity, and with Gilliman himself, who had chosen to walk beside him through the corridors of the palace rather than observe through a relay, who had decided that whatever occurred next would occur in his presence. What happened in the throne room I have pieced together from multiple accounts. A senior librarian monitoring the psychic environment described a sustained exchange at a frequency and intensity beyond anything previously recorded, not hostile, identifiable as 2 distinct psychic signatures in sustained communication, lasting approximately 4 hours. A custodian who was present in the outer chamber described the quality of silence inside the throne room during those 4 hours as the most complete silence she had experienced in the palace in a century of service, and said that at no point did anything occur that registered as threatening. Gilliman told me, in a conversation some months later that he had not originally intended to have, and that I have handled with the discretion it warranted, that when Horus entered the throne room and saw what the Emperor had become after 10,000 years in the throne, he stopped moving for approximately 30 seconds. Then he knelt. Gilliman had not expected this. He had prepared, as much as it was possible to prepare, for confrontation, for supplication, for some form of theatrical declaration that the arch-traitor's return to the center of the Imperium after 10,000 years might be expected to produce. He had not prepared for Horus Lupercal, bearing the marks of all 4 Chaos gods, to walk into the throne room and kneel. He stayed there for 4 hours. The psychic exchange that the librarians monitoring the environment recorded lasted those 4 hours and produced readings that required a new notation system to document. When Horus emerged from the throne room, Gilliman observed his face and described what he saw as the expression of a man who has received an answer to a question he has been carrying longer than most civilizations last. He walked back through the palace corridors toward the shuttle bay, past the custodians, past Gilliman himself, and as he walked, he said one thing. He said he knew, he has always known, and he chose not to say so, and I am not certain anymore whether that makes him right or wrong, but I understand it. He went back to orbit. He convened the senior council of the assembled force in the flagship's command space. He told the 12 commanders that the campaign was concluding. He told them that the specific objectives the campaign had been designed to achieve had been achieved, not in the military sense of positions taken or targets destroyed, but in the sense that the information the campaign had been conducted in service of had been obtained. He told them he was returning to the Eye. Kratos found the decision incomprehensible and said so. Horus listened to the objections until they were finished. Then he said, "We will return. When we return, it will be with what I have now confirmed, which is a complete understanding of what we are actually fighting for. We have been waging a war for 10,000 years without knowing what victory in that war actually looks like. I know now. We are going to spend the time between now and our next campaign preparing correctly for the correct objective." He dismissed the council. We left Terra orbit. No one fired. The transit back through the Cadian Gate and into the Eye gave me time to hold everything that had happened at the distance necessary to look at it before deciding what it meant. I had gone to Asphodel expecting either failure or a military campaign that would end in either the Imperium's collapse or our destruction. Neither of those things had occurred. The most capable military commander in human history had been reconstructed from soul fragments by all 4 Chaos gods, had led the largest coordinated chaos force in centuries, had reached Terra orbit, had descended to the surface, had knelt before the Golden Throne, and had chosen to leave. I found him on the observation deck of the flagship during the transit back, standing at the forward viewport, looking at the movement of the Eye's characteristic light patterns as we approached the boundary. I had observed this habit often enough by now to know it was not idleness. When Horus stood looking at nothing in particular, he was thinking at a depth that required the absence of immediate stimulus. Interrupting him was not something I would normally do, but we were 3 days from the Eye, and I had carried the question long enough, and he had already told me more than I had expected him to tell anyone in the conversation on the fortress world, so I approached. He heard me and did not turn immediately. I asked him what the Emperor had said. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He did not say anything. He cannot speak, you know that." I said, "You came back knowing something you did not know when you left." He said, "Yes." I waited. He said, "What I understood from those 4 hours was not a communication in the sense of sentences and structured meaning. It was a recognition, a mutual recognition of something we both know, and that we have been approaching from opposite directions for 10,000 years. I said, "What is it?" He turned then, and those 4 colored eyes in the dim light of the observation deck carried something in them that I had not seen there since his restoration, something that was not quite grief and not quite certainty, but contained elements of both. He said, "The Emperor is not dying. He has not been dying for 10,000 years. He has been becoming. What he becomes when the process is complete is something that neither the Imperium nor the Chaos Gods had correctly understood or prepared for. And what I confirmed in that throne room is this: my original understanding of what needed to happen was correct. The form of my intervention was wrong. The method was wrong. The timing was wrong. But the fundamental recognition that something needed to happen, that the transition could not simply be indefinitely deferred while the galaxy consumed itself around a man who was neither alive nor dead, on a throne that was never meant to hold him forever, that recognition was correct. I did not respond immediately. He turned back to the viewport. He said, "We are not fighting a war against the Imperium, Arevas. We have never been fighting a war against the Imperium. We have been fighting a war about the Emperor." about what he is and what he is becoming, and who should be present when that process concludes, and what understanding they should bring to how it ends. The Chaos Gods have one answer, the Imperium has another, I have a third. I said, "What is your third answer?" He said, "That the process must be allowed to complete. That every effort to interrupt or defer it, from either direction, from either the Chaos side or the Imperial side, is not protection and not victory but delay. That I spent 10,000 years in the space where his psychic will is most present, and what I learned there is that he does not want to be saved in the current form, and he does not want to be destroyed. He wants to finish, and no one has been willing to allow it." He paused. He said, "I am willing." The eye accepted us back through its boundary with the same unusual lack of resistance that had characterized our emergence. The vast non-light of the immaterium closed around the fleet, and the material universe receded behind us, and ahead lay the familiar, impossible landscape of the warp in its demon world configurations, the home I had occupied for 10,000 years, and that I had never been able to truly call home, but that was the only place I still existed. I went to my quarters and sat with what he had told me and tried to decide what to make of it. The months that followed were unlike any period I had lived through in 10,000 years of residence in the Eye. The force that had assembled at Asphodel did not disperse. Chaos forces have a natural tendency toward dissolution after any campaign. The individual warbands and legion remnants held together by immediate purpose and separated by its removal. The natural state of chaos warfare reasserting itself as fragmentation and competition, and the kind of internecine violence that the Imperium has always regarded, with some justification, as a limiting factor on chaos military effectiveness. The force that had fought alongside Horus to Terra orbit and back should have begun dispersing within days of return. It did not. Horus was present, and his presence functioned as an organizing principle in a way that no other being I had observed in 10,000 years of the Long War had managed to sustain. It was not fear. The warbands were not loyal from terror. It was something older and more structural, the recognition operating in the deep, strategically oriented mind of every chaos warrior, regardless of their patron god or personal history, that the being at the center of this force possessed something that could not be replicated, and that operating in proximity to it was more likely to produce meaningful results than operating away from it. He rewarded that recognition with attention. He learned every commander's name, not just the 12 on the senior council, every warband leader, every legion captain who had survived 10,000 years in the Eye with sufficient coherence to command effectively. He learned their histories and their specific capabilities, and their relationships with their patron gods, and their particular forms of transformation over the millennia. He built a picture of the assembled force that was more comprehensive than any catalogue that had ever been attempted of the chaos military in the Eye, and he used that picture to design something that produced, in the more traditional chaos commanders, a reaction ranging from bewilderment to active offense, a training program. He was teaching the chaos forces to fight as a single army, rather than as a collection of mutually suspicious warbands who happened to be occupying the same operational space. He was teaching coordination at a level and with a patience that no chaos commander had ever successfully applied to forces of this composition, and he was doing it not through coercion but through the systematic creation of situations in which coordination produced results that the individual components could not achieve separately, which is the only way you teach beings who are constitutionally resistant to the surrender of individual agency to collective purpose. I observed this for 6 months and spent 6 months being awed by it in the way that genuine strategic intelligence awes the people who are close enough to watch it work. At the end of 6 months, I went to him with the question that had been accumulating since the throne room. I found him in the temporary ordinary light that the Eye occasionally produces for brief periods, standing at the flagship's observation deck during one of those rare 4-hour windows when the light coming through the viewport had the quality of something that the body recognizes below conscious memory as what ordinary existence felt like before everything that followed the heresy. He was there, of course. He always went to that space when the ordinary light arrived. Whatever else the 10,000 years had done to him, It had not removed the capacity to recognize what ordinary existence felt like and to want it. I stood beside him and looked at the light. Then I asked the question I had been building towards since the transit back from Terra. I said, "Why did you come back?" He did not answer immediately, and I understood that the question deserved the full attention he was giving it. He said, "Because the war has an ending, and I know what it is, and the people who do not know what it is are fighting it in directions that will never reach it. I came back because 10,000 years was long enough to understand something that would have taken forever to understand from inside a living body. And I came back because the gods made me offer they believed was in their interest, and I accepted it because it was in mine, and those two interests do not overlap in the way they expected." I said, "What do you want?" He looked at me, and the four-colored eyes in the fading light of the eye's brief ordinary moment held something that I had not expected, something that was quieter and more private than anything I had seen him express in the months of the campaign. He said, "I want to know that it mattered, everything, the crusade and the heresy, and the 10,000 years, and what I was, and what I became. I want to know that there was a reason that was worth the price, and I confirmed in that throne room that there was. That what he is becoming requires exactly the sequence of events that occurred, including my betrayal and my death and my dissolution and my reconstruction, because without that sequence the process does not reach the configuration it needs to reach in order to complete correctly." He paused. He said, "I was always part of the plan. I simply did not know it, and he could not tell me, because if I had known, I would not have made the choices I made, and the choices had to be made authentically, or they did not have the effect the plan required." I sat with that for a long time. He went back to looking at the temporary ordinary light. "I have been in the eye for 10,000 years. I have followed Horus Lupercal from a Ganger world in the Sol system to the siege of the Emperor's throne, and back again, and through everything that came after. I have fought wars I did not understand, for reasons that shifted with every century, accumulating a history so large that it no longer fits comfortably in the mind that contains it, and has to be archived in the way you archive things that are too significant to forget and too heavy to carry consciously. I am old in the way that the word old was not designed to contain. I am made of 10,000 years of choices and battles, and survived catastrophes and personal losses, and the specific quality of experience that belongs to someone who has lived long enough to see everything they believed tested until the belief itself becomes less a conviction than an archaeological site. What I found at that site, standing in the temporary ordinary light beside the reconstituted War Master on a demon world in the Eye of Terror, was simpler than I had expected. I was right to follow him, not because everything he had done was right, not because the heresy was justified or its consequences warranted, not because 10,000 years of the long war had produced an outcome proportional to its cost. I was right to follow him because the alternative was to follow something smaller, and I had never been able to make my peace with smaller. Whatever Horus Lupercal was, whatever the gods had made of him, and whatever he had made of himself across 10 millennia of dissolution and reconstruction, he was oriented toward the actual truth of what was happening in this galaxy, rather than the comfortable story of it. And in a universe this large, and this indifferent, and this willing to consume everything you care about without acknowledgement, that orientation toward truth was the only quality I had ever been able to respect without reservation. He knew what the war was about now. For the first time in 10,000 years, so did I. The eye surrounded us. The campaign was not over. Nothing was over. But something had changed in the months since the ritual at Asphodel that could not be unchanged, and that would take the form in the decades and centuries to come of something that neither the Chaos Gods, nor Robot Guilliman, nor the 10,000 years of institutional assumption on both sides of the Long War had prepared anyone to account for. Horus Lupercal had come back, and he had come back knowing something. In a universe where almost nothing could be said with certainty, that knowledge was the most dangerous thing in it. I have written this account because I believe it should exist. I have written it in the Eye of Terror, on a demon world whose name changes with the week, and whose physical properties are best not examined with too much attention, using methods of record keeping that predate my formal military service, and that I intend to outlast my death. I am a survivor. It is the one quality I have maintained without significant interruption across 10,000 years, and I intend to continue it through whatever comes next. Whatever comes next will be unprecedented. The war that is coming is not the war that has been fought for 10,000 years. The war that is coming is the one that the 10,000 years were preparation for, whether anyone on either side understood that at the time or not. I was born on Chthoniya. I have lived through more history than I was built to contain. I have followed the War Master to the end of one epoch and watched him begin to navigate the beginning of whatever follows it. I remain uncertain whether we were right. I remain certain that we are not finished.